I don't know if you've heard this or not, but there's this myth going around that doing team topologies correctly is a matter of picking these 4 team types and then assigning them to existing teams. I don't know if that's the case. That hasn't been my experience with it. I have a hard time imagining how picking team names and assigning it to teams is going to work. So I think in this video, we're going to dig into exactly how team topologies discusses these things so we can figure out if there's anything to this myth at all. So the myth goes team topologies is all about taking the 4 team types and assigning them to your teams. So it's probably a good thing, by the way, that I've actually bought a copy of the book and I've read it. So let's take a look at the table of contents and find out what's inside of the book. So if we take a look at this, we're going to find out that those team types are actually half of one chapter. So what are the other 8.5 chapters of this book about if they're not about assigning team types? Well, if we just take a quick look here, we're going to see there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about how teams should be interacting, how teams should be organized, what kinds of mindsets they should have, the architecture related to Conway's law, organizational sensing to determine what's going on in your company so you can adapt correctly to those different changes and change your team topology because there is no one ideal topology for everything. And when I think about this myth, I always think about the problems that people come to me about saying, I have a lot of these problems. And simply assigning a team type to a team isn't the solution there. And it ends up being one of 2 major groups in my experience that create slowdowns inside of teams and organizations and kind of block that fast flow feature. This first one I run into pretty much every single time I encounter any company with more than 5 teams. And definitely when you enter a company with 20 teams, I suspect it's going to be there. And that's some kind of legacy from people doing these inter-team dependency giant project management things. And that's where you say, okay, I've got this company, and inside my company, I've got 5 engineering teams, and we're going to break up the quarter into 12 weeks. And every week is going to be pre-planned with what each team's going to work on. And when we have a dependency from one team to another, we're going to draw a red line. And those red lines can be very dangerous to your fast flow. We need to kind of figure out how to get rid of them. And this is a place where simply assigning a team name, saying you're a platform team, you're a stream, doesn't remove the lines because we haven't done the work to dig inside and figure out why do those red lines exist in the first place. And one of the problems with this is these red lines are almost an acceptance of the fact that we can't do any better, which is wrong. And one of the reasons I like team topologies is it's a whole bunch of ways to guide your thinking around how do we remove those red lines in the first place? How do we discover what creates those red lines so we can get informed views about these things? It's a way to navigate the reason those lines exist and a set of tools to help you remove them. It does a lot more than that, but in this case, one of the most common reasons that I've found for slowing things down is inter-team dependencies. And team topologies, one of the things it does is guide your thinking around how to remove it. Now, it doesn't tell you every technique that you need to know. So it could be that you need to use an event architecture, or maybe you need to use a different mono repo or a single standalone repo. I don't know. But it provides that extra layer of thinking for you so you can identify what's creating the slowdowns and figure out how am I going to work these out of my organizational design. And that's different. That's the fundamental difference for me when I think about this, which is team topologies is discussing how do we change the way we get work done from an organizational design so that we can move things through the organization faster. And so rejecting things like the team topologies interaction types and only looking at the team shapes themselves, like is this a platform, is this a stream, is this a complicated subsystem, excluding all the other stuff and not looking at how are those 2 teams interacting. As an example, are they doing X as a service? Are they doing facilitation? Are they collaborating? Ignoring what's going on in the interactions and not classifying it correctly is one of those things that's going to end up slowing you down when you need to make big transformational work to improve the flow of value and flow of change through your organization. So in team topologies, they have 3, maybe 4 types of interactions, with the 4th one being an undefined interaction where you're like, okay, I know those teams are interacting, but we just don't know why or how. And that's just, you just have to admit that it's an undefined interaction. But the core types are things like X as a service, which is very powerful and says, these 2 teams are interacting basically through an API. They don't need to go knock on the door, hand over tickets, change code together at the same time, organize a super project on a Gantt chart somewhere with a project manager stretching out months. They just use something as an API or a package or a wiki somewhere that they can self-service. And if you have this self-service, you don't have those red lines on that big program increment chart that you think you need to have every quarter. Now, that can't always be the case, right? Sometimes teams need to make changes and discuss like, hey, this API doesn't give me everything I need, or I need to make a change, or you need to make a change to update to something, or we found a boundary conflict. Like things happen and things should happen if you're changing the organization. Eventually something will happen and those teams need to work together, which is why we have the collaboration mode. And collaboration mode is saying, okay, these two teams are working together, but they're working together in pursuit of never needing to work together again on the same sort of thing. So this is not a regular dependency line. And that's one of the things that we get messed up so often when we only look at the types of teams we have is we don't look at how do we remove dependencies between teams as a permanent fixture of our organizational design. And something like collaboration mode, which says we should not have heavy dependencies between all of our teams to do handovers or sequentially deliver something on the value stream or something like this. It says we should work to not have these things happening all the time. That's a good goal to have. That's a really valuable mindset to have inside of an organization, right? It's a type of thinking that gets rid of dependencies. It's a forcing function to remove them. And if that thinking is not embedded in your company, you're missing out. And you're not going to get that by thinking, oh yeah, this is a streamlined team. Oh, this one is a complicated subsystem. It's not enough. You have to think beyond this. And the third core type, just to put it in there for you, is this facilitating feature. Facilitating is quite interesting because you're not really providing a product and you're not working on code together. Basically, somebody or a group of people who know a lot about a certain topic, maybe it's cloud infrastructure, maybe it's a search engine, maybe it's something else, they're exchanging skills and up-leveling the skills in the subject team so that they can do things faster on their own without ending up in a situation where they have to wait helplessly for somebody else to come and fix their problems for them. It's a bit like somebody teaching you how to change a tire in a car. So when your car breaks down, you know how to change that tire and you're not sitting there waiting for the tow truck. Maybe you can just change the tire on your own because somebody taught you how to do it. Now, there's a whole extra layer to this thing when you think about inter-team dependencies, but not between cross-functional teams that share knowledge and just do handovers or need other people to do their stuff for them. But you can actually go a step further and say, well, we have teams of job functions. So you have something like that's the product team, that's the backend team, that's the front-end team and the QA team and the infra team. And they are all job function pools, but they don't work together on anything. They're basically sitting together with a certain job function and handing stuff over from one person to the next. But none of them are legitimate teams. Like they don't work together on anything. I think it's more accurate to say these are reporting hierarchies. These are pools of resources. And we're asking for the manager of some resource pool to do some work and flip it over to the next person. And so something that I've seen happen to people who believe this myth that we don't have to make changes to how people work together and we shouldn't have cross-functional teams and we shouldn't get rid of those handovers because we fundamentally can't trust developers and product managers to work together for some reason and we can't trust QA to work with developers. I've even seen that. And somehow nobody who designed, thought about, built the software, or tested it can be trusted to run that software in production. That's the duty of some other people who have no idea what the software is or how it works. That's another handover. But even in that environment, I've seen people fall for this myth and say, okay, well, I have a backend team, but now they're a stream-aligned backend team. So they're the everything backend stream, but they still get stuff handed over to them from a pool of resources, and they themselves are still a pool of resources. The only thing that changed, to be honest, was a slide deck that executives share with each other and investors, but like no way of working materially changed. So why would we expect real change to happen inside of the company as well? But thinking about things like team topologies, it gives us a whole bunch of ways to think about this problem. It's like, okay, how does value flow through the organization? What's the flow of change through our organization? When we have these handovers, we end up going slow, and we end up going slow because it takes time to hand something over, put it into a new queue. We can't have the same group of people own, evolve, and maintain that stuff because they're all acting as different groups. But that alone is actually the best case scenario. The reality is much worse because always something will go wrong. And when something goes wrong, you get this back pressure ripping through your whole company back up the handover stack. So if QA discovers, oh, something's wrong with my software, they're going to give it back to the front end team, for instance, say, oh, there's something wrong with this, please fix it. Or it could be that they say, oh, actually, we know it's in the back end because we just have experience for it. Or they create a duplicate ticket and they give it over to the back end team. Or you might not even get to QA. You might just have something that the backend developers built. They shipped an API, they gave it to the front end team. Front end team got to work and said, oh, you know what? We're missing 5-6 fields. And they ship the ticket back over to the backend team and wait for them to fix it. But here's the issue. While all of that is happening, there's this enormous amount of pressure coming from the other way to make sure that there's something those other teams can work on. So they're not sitting there idle waiting for the next task. There ends up being a whole bunch of work pushed upwards saying, while you're waiting for the backend developers to fix that API, can you maybe do something like this? So now whatever context they had in their mind is being evaporated by the new work. So they're going to have to put down and forget what they're doing and start building some new context on something else. And then when it's time for that backend API that might have only taken a few hours to change, when that comes back into the work queue for that next resource pool, that front end team is already occupied working on that last task. So are they going to, again, waste time context switching and going back to something and rebuilding context, figuring out what this thing is, what change did they make, does it work, and then push it back up to the next team? Or are they going to say, well, if we're going to wait a while until we're done this thing and then we'll come back and pick that one up because it's the next in queue? Doesn't matter. They're all slow situations. And for me, that's the real thing here about team topologies. Yes, the team types are important, but there's so much more to think about here beyond the team types, such as how are they interacting inside of the team and between the teams. And if you're missing that stuff, you're missing some incredibly important stuff about team topologies. And not only that, the organizational modeling that you might do with the group of executives or engineering product leaders is only part of that equation. You have to make sure through Conway's law, which is again mentioned in the book, you have to make sure that the architecture of the software makes sense as well for what you're doing. Because if your architecture is one giant mess, but your organizational design is asking for a clean divide through it, you won't have fast flow between the teams. And so figuring out what's impeding the flow, sensing these problems, this is what's going to fix it for you. And so for me, team topology is not about figuring out a nice, beautiful picture that we can draw or cool titles to put on teams that seem to be in vogue. And if we spend all of our time ignoring all these other concepts, we will never be successful with team topologies. We have to get into all the details to figure out how is our socio-technical system owned and evolved? How is it structured? What's impeding the flow? So what did we actually learn here? I think the main thing to take away here is team topology itself is a much larger conversation than simply assigning team types to some teams. In fact, there's a huge amount of importance on many other factors in what we call this socio-technical system. And those factors are things like inter-team dependencies, but even not just on the organizational level, getting down into the code itself, making sure that the code is set up correctly to remove these dependencies between teams to ensure there's fast flow, but also even going a step further and looking like, how do your teams work? Are your teams themselves set up for fast flow? Are your people, process, technology, culture, maybe even your product, is it all set up correctly to ensure fast flow of value through your organization? And simply labeling teams different things, this is only one small component to the puzzle. And this helps us identify what teams aspire to moving towards and not necessarily what they are. And actually, team topologies itself is only part of that equation. You have to combine it with a whole bunch of other things in practice to fully manifest fast flow and the ideals that are discussed in the book. You're not going to achieve that simply by reading the book, which doesn't have deep conversations on software architecture, for instance. And it doesn't explain to you how to make your operating model of reporting lines handle things correctly. It doesn't discuss how to implement that culture. So team topologies provides a lot of really useful thinking that guides your thoughts around these things, but it's not the only thought in the equation. And although the team types themselves are quite interesting, they're not the whole piece of the puzzle. There's so much more beyond it that we need to go if we're going to implement it correctly. So that's really everything that we have to find out about this myth. If you want to find out more myths, don't forget to like and subscribe down in the comments so you can get notified when the next one's coming out.